Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today's video is going to be a response to Reality Survival's Martial Law Will Never Happen in America. Now, his goal with this video was an attempt to debunk the notion that martial law could ever happen in the United States. If you haven't checked out Reality Survival's channel yet, go and check him out. Very level-headed guy, puts out a lot of videos as of late, but I know that if I go and sit through a Reality Survival video, it's going to be well worth it. I'm going to learn something. But with respect to the video in question, I would have to disagree with some of the premises that he uses to justify his conclusion. Now, the two key points he made, and I think he made a few more, but these are the ones that I remember from the video, were that number one, the civilian firepower in the United States vastly overwhelms the military firepower. I'm going to criticize that statement in a minute. But there's also the idea that there's the patriot mentality, the constitutionalist mentality, which would prevent a lot of law enforcement and military personnel from doing anything which was anti-constitutional. So basically he's saying that lots of people would defect and go AWOL in a situation where martial law was attempted to be implemented on a massive scale in the United States. Now, there's a lot for me to discuss here, so I'm gonna cut right to the chase at the beginning, but if you stick around to the end, I want to talk about an important point with respect to what martial law actually is and the different ways that it can come about and how that would really be a key factor in determining whether or not it could be imposed on the United States population. So here's some of the reasons why I think that martial law could in fact happen in the United States. Now, I want to say first off that I'm not one of these people who scream in martial law for no apparent reason, just for the sake of martial law and imposing tyranny on the population. I'm not one of these people that thinks it's necessarily going to happen, but what I'm trying to put forth in this video is ways that it could happen. Now, one of the main reasons why I think it could happen is due to the superiority and firepower of the military and even local law enforcement over the civilian population. Now, he talks about how there's a 30-to-1 ratio in terms of civilian firepower to military firepower, and I don't know where he got those statistics. I don't doubt that those statistics are accurate, but the technological superiority of the American military, of all militaries in the world, is a huge reason why it could be implemented. You're talking about tanks, MRAPs, all kinds of air support, helicopters, armored vehicles. You got millimeter wave guns, smart bombs, rail guns, all manner of ordnance that you could possibly imagine would be up against the tricked out AR-15s and all the other small arms that the civilian population is privy to. Now, if that wasn't enough that the firepower of the military far, far exceeds the civilian population in terms of the actual level of technology. So sure, you may have 30 guys armed with AR-15s, but you put that up against a fully automatic, high caliber gun mounted on a helicopter or something like that, and there's no competition. Now, we're going to come back to this because there is the asymmetrical warfare aspect, which would be a very big hurdle to overcome if we were talking about some sort of uprising after the tyranny was imposed. But there's another huge factor that he's not thinking about here, and it's drones and robotics, and he actually showed them in his video. Now, one drone, think about the destruction that one unmanned aerial vehicle can do. They're autonomous. One person can control several different drones. And if you know that there's a drone in the sky that can strike down on you at any given moment of the day or detect whether perhaps you're out after curfew or something like that, are going to vastly change the battlefield in the favor of the military, which is trying to impose martial law. Not only do the drones make up for the disadvantage of manpower on the part of the military, but they're an exponential force multiplier. Think about the sheer full spectrum dominance that you have over a battlefield when you have dozens of these unmanned aerial vehicles being flown by a handful of people from a remote location. Not only that, you factor in your satellite imaging, and all of a sudden these small-scale militias, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. Then you also have the advancements of robotics and the whole autonomous processes with respect to that, which in the next decade or so will likely become more active in the US military. Now that said, somebody's going to bring up the point about asymmetrical warfare, and indeed, if the Iraqis gave the US military as much of a run for their money as they did, just imagine the run for their money that they're going to have in the United States. But the problem with that whole argument is that you're assuming that there's going to be some sort of unified front that is going to be wanting to resist whatever tyranny is trying to be imposed. That's a very big assumption. I'm going to talk about reasons why I don't think that that sort of collective resistance, at least not on the level as seen in other countries like Vietnam or Iraq, is going to take place. As much as US citizens like to pride themselves on patriotism and whatnot, the fact is that it's such a melting pot of different cultures and different ideas, different ethnic backgrounds, that to have that level of unity really only happens in the movies. Now, I get the whole, it was only 3% who started the American Revolution, or was it 5%? I can't remember, something like that. But you gotta remember that back in those days, it was muskets against muskets. Now it's frickin' laser guns against 1960s AR-15 technology. Now, I'm not saying that they're unbeatable necessarily. What I'm saying is that at least for the short term, martial law could very well be effectively employed across a large part of the United States if the logistics and the comms were all up to snuff. Now, reality survival uses the example of Chicago and how perhaps the people there might be a tad unruly, to say the least, and that this defiance of authority is going to complicate the imposition of martial law. But I want to challenge that also and say that because they're so disorganized, and we need to remember here that while there is a lot of crime, while crime is quite rampant in some of these communities, the fact is the only reason why it's not full-blown without rule of law is that people, for the most part, like 90% of people, even in those cities that are hit really hard like Jersey, Chicago, Detroit, the only reason why it isn't all-out chaos is that people do fear the judicial process and the consequences that come from them. And that's why one police officer is able to effectively police 100 to 1,000 people. That's generally the ratio in any city you go to in North America. You got one cop per 100 to 1,000 people. And that typically does work because the police are so organized and the military is so organized. See, the proof that martial law could be implemented is in the fact that those ratios of law enforcement to civilians works right now, for the most part. It's the threat of punishment that keeps people obedient, not necessarily the boots on the ground. Now, here's the thing. In the case of excessive rule of law, martial law, whatever you want to call it, military dictatorship, the threat of punishment is going to be magnified. It's going to be exponentially magnified to such an extent that people might fear the use of lethal force. Put it this way, if you knew that shit had hit the fan and you knew that the military was shooting people on sight who are out after curfew, I can guarantee you right now that you're not going to see a lot of people out after curfew. At least in the short term, people are going to be very compliant. Another point to bring up here is that in spite of the fact that America has this gun culture, the fact is many people in America have been, for the most part, pacified in many ways. They've been trained to be obedient. If you look at the level of disobedience and defiance in other countries, take Greece, for instance, where guys will go out in the streets and fight the police. They'll get fully geared up. They'll bring weapons. It's a war. And you don't see that in the United States. And there's a variety of reasons which relate back to the overwhelming diversity within the United States. And I'm not knocking the diversity. I think the diversity is a good thing. But when you're talking about imposing martial law on a people, I think that works in the favor of the powers that be in that situation, because it's harder for the people to unify against that threat. There's not a millennia-old cultural tradition that unifies people in the United States. It's a melting pot which has been thrown together with a variety of different ingredients in the past few hundred years. Now, the next point that Reality Survival makes, and I'm going to challenge, is that the authorities, whoever they may be, military, police, will not enforce martial law because it's anti-constitutional. Now, here's the problem with that, is that there's all manner of law enforcement and military doing things that are anti-constitutional right now, arguably. And not only that, if there ever was some military coup or military dictatorship, martial law, whatever, you're going to have some pretty aggressive brainwashing and propaganda being pushed on the troops, telling them that we have to do this for the greater good, you know, that it's important to preserve the liberties and the rights and all the American stuff. So they'll just flip it and say that this is to preserve those liberties, but while doing so, of course, they'll be infringing on them. The other reason that this is going to be possible, like I said before, it's such a diverse culture. There's 330 million people in the United States. There's a lot of differences there. So it's very easy then for you to forget that you are policing and tyrannizing your own countrymen, especially when what the strategy might be will be to send people who are from a certain region. So let's say you're stationed in Texas and there's this martial law situation imposed. A good strategist would move the troops from Texas to, say, California, a region where they're not going to have that personal community connection with. That way it's going to be easier for them to impose that martial law without having those feelings of going against their fellow countrymen. And of course you want to keep, you know, the higher up chain of command who is from that region, who's familiar with that region. You want your top brass to be well acclimated to whatever environment they're going to be policing. And social psychology tells us that in most situations, people will be willing to commit atrocities if they do not have to be personally held accountable. And if they send you off to another state and you know that you don't have any family there, you don't have any personal connections that might cause you to think twice about pulling the trigger, and you knew that you were totally absolved of legal responsibility, well, the research shows that you'll probably follow orders. And to ensure that you follow orders, there's probably going to be some pretty harsh punishments brought on members of law enforcement in the military who choose to defect. It wouldn't be very hard to do this, just like in Stalinist Russia. You take 1 out of every 12 soldiers, you give them a slight raise, you give them some perks, and you get them to be moles and to give you intel on whether or not there's defectors, whether or not there's a planned coup. People will enforce and people will obey. And if they don't, once again, they're outgunned. As I said before, the lack of common heritage, it means that people are going to be less patriotic, not more patriotic. Yes, you have that small subsection of the population which is highly patriotic, but them unto themselves against the firepower of the American military, the most powerful military in the world, plus law enforcement, they're going to lose. Now, the concept of martial law becomes very obscure when we don't identify what the actual cause of that martial law is going to be, because it's going to manifest in different ways. Now, in a pandemic scenario, you're probably going to have a lot more of a compliant population who's not going to want to go outside, because not only is there fear of the military, but there's a fear of getting sick. So a pandemic martial law is going to be much different than, say, a incremental economic collapse military police state type martial law, and that's going to be much different from a post-World War III martial law imposition, which could be pretty nasty, and that still is going to be different from the tyrannical form of martial law, which is the one that I believe people are going to be most resistant against. And it's only really in that instance where the actual principles of democracy are challenged, where I think that the whole sentiment about the Constitution is going to cause military men to be going AWOL in droves. See, in most situations, especially after the smoke from the initial riots clear, lots of people are going to welcome the presence of the military as a sign of the reestablishment of law and order. And so by the time they've dug in and people may have realized some of the rights that they've conceded, it's probably too late. Anyways, so those are some of the reasons I think that martial law is very possible in the United States. You know, a lot of people get hung up on the idea, you know, with, what was it, Switzerland, all men were armed, and, you know, the reason why Hitler didn't invade Switzerland and yada, 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 because everybody was armed and it would have been hell. You know, that's a possibility. Or, you know, maybe there was something else going on in World War II with the profiteers that we don't know about. Regardless, the United States is not Switzerland in that sense. There is no uniformity in terms of culture, ethnicity, and all those things which would be the building blocks for that level of solidified resistance. Anyways, let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.